been a major figure in international policy for the United States and in education at the Belfer Center, where our objective is to teach, train, and do research on subjects related to the applications of science and technology for international affairs. We have scholars, practitioners, students, all working to address the gaps and the opportunities for technology, science, and geopolitics. I'm very delighted to have everybody here today. The Emerging Tech program, which I have the honor of running, was launched about a year ago, specifically to look at where emerging technologies are creating new policy frontiers, new opportunities to use policy to use technology to engage in policy, and the implications that technologies are creating for governance, geopolitics, global stability, and global conflict. And the Move 37 initiative that we're here to talk to you about today is a part of that program. As you can imagine, in a program that's relating technologies to modern issues around geopolitics, that artificial intelligence is one of the major aspects of our work. We have a terrific panel here today. It's my pleasure to introduce them by name, and we'll talk a little bit more about each one in just a moment. The missing chair, which we expect shortly, is Gabriela Ramos, who's the former Assistant Director General for Social and Human Sciences at UNESCO. Nandita Balakrishnan is the Director of Intelligence at the Special Competitive Studies Project in Washington. And Robin Scott is the CEO and co-founder of Apolitical. And then at the far end, two of my colleagues, researchers on our program at the Belfer Center. Charlie Pozniak is a full-time fellow with the program, research fellow with the program. And Slavina Ancheva is a current student within our program, an MPP student at the Belfer Center. I also want to acknowledge a colleague of ours who is not here, was not able to get to India in time for the conference, Carme Artigas, who is the former co-chair of the UN AI Advisory Panel, who has been an integral part of starting this work and the ongoing progress we are making. Carme is also the Spain-India ambassador for AI, High Commissioner in Spain-India for AI, and is here with us in spirit and maybe even on the live stream that we're doing here today. So a big shout out to Carme for all of her help. So why are we here? We are embarking on a major new project, specifically looking at the use of artificial intelligence in diplomacy and negotiation. We are here at a conference about the use of artificial intelligence and the implications of artificial intelligence in so many aspects of society. And our work is looking at how one will engage non-human intelligences in the process of diplomacy and negotiation. So we're here because this is a broad-based project. It is not something that is solely the purview of a small team in Cambridge where we are located, but something that we are looking for collaborators, partners, and input from the community here and the community around the world as we build what will surely be a place where AI is used, and surely will be a place where we need to be cognizant and careful about how AI will be used in that exercise. So the work we do plays on an increasingly bigger role in shaping the relationships between states and within states. We want to have this conversation about the role for AI specifically because of the global nature and the integrated way that AI will play. And more specifically, how will we use artificial intelligence tools to augment humans in what is at its core a fundamentally human process of negotiation and diplomacy? Diplomatic negotiations are very high stakes. They are very different, as you will hear from our team, very different than classic one-on-one win-lose negotiations or win-win negotiations. They are very much more complex than that, and that means they require both a unique human touch and a unique application of how artificial intelligence might be used in that process. But it's also an area where an enormous amount of potential exists to tackle resource constraints, to find better outcomes, and to use artificial intelligence to enable a more stable and prosperous world, and one for which the follow-up to negotiations can be a subject for the tools and applications of modern technology. How we go about that is crucial, and how we talk about it from the beginning is crucial. There are already a number of tools emerging in this space, but it's our belief that a more rigorous approach is needed, and you'll hear some of that in just a moment. So what are we going to do? Our team is going to do a brief overview of the way we are thinking about this problem. And after that, we're going to have this amazing panel that we will engage in a conversation about views from others who are involved in negotiation and or diplomacy writ large, and their views on how technology can be used well, or be used not so well, and what the implications of that will be. So with that, let me turn it over to Charlie and Slavina to talk about the project itself. I think Slavina's up first.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for being here this morning. A big welcome. Over the next 10 minutes or so, Charlie and myself would like to present you with a little bit of a framing for the expert discussion that we'll be getting into right after. We'll broadly focus on 3 areas: how do negotiation processes currently look and the complexity that comes with them, the potential for AI to augment many of these challenges and processes, thinking beyond just LLMs, and the need for responsible deployment of these tools. Before we do that, I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine. You walk into a negotiation, you look down at the agenda, and there's 10 items on it. But as any good negotiator, you know that it's not just about those 10 items. It's a lot of other factors that are happening both inside and outside that room that are affecting how that negotiation process is happening. So for one example, you're sitting across 7 counterparts from 7 political groups, 7 different countries, and behind you, you have your own team, but also 27 other countries that you're representing, that you've promised a certain outcome or a certain deal. Of course, this is not my story. It's the story of Carme Artigas that Michael mentioned, who was one of the chief negotiators of the EU AI Act, and later the UN AI Advisory Body, and many other negotiations. But it's not just her story. It's the story of many of you. It's the negotiations that you've engaged in at the UN, at COP, bilateral negotiations, interagency negotiations within your own organizations. So you know very well that negotiations are complex and they evolve over time. So what might look like just 2 states negotiating with each other bilaterally is actually a whole set of issues that are on the table. It could be natural resources, it could be AI, it could be climate, and a whole lot of external and internal stakeholders that are also trying to influence that process. We start to dive into some of this complexity. And more than that, there's a lot of teams that are sitting behind these principal negotiators, the different departments and agencies that are supporting them with evidence, with documents. And we'd really like to stress that this is a fundamentally interpersonal process. We're not looking to replace diplomats or negotiators here, but just to give them the tools to manage these complexities much better. And finally, rarely in this world do we have just 2 states negotiating nowadays. There's often a 3rd state at the table. In the case of the EU, maybe 27 member states, and of course, a lot of hundreds of others that could be out there. So with that being said, what are some of the impacts of this complexity? Well, for one, there's a whole lot of information that needs to be managed. There's a simple negotiation can generate thousands of documents, transcripts, drafts. On top of that, there's a certain amount of finite resources that any team has as they grapple with many other challenges throughout the day. There's a lot of strategic elements. Sometimes in groups, you might have groupthink or herding that leads you in one direction as opposed to exploring your full set of options. And finally, there's the time pressure. So most negotiations do have some sort of time element and handover element to future teams. So with that being said, how can AI help? And I'd like to turn it over to Charlie.
Thanks, Lavina. So AI systems can now beat some of the best human players at Go, at chess, at video games, at board games. Language models, as we've heard, have become increasingly competent at delivering a range of sophisticated legal, academic, technical, software contributions. The pace of change has been staggering. And so what our interdisciplinary team has been looking at is we're trying to envision a better future for diplomacy where computational methods can transform the practice of diplomatic negotiations and statecraft that Slavina just outlined. So supporting better communications, better resolutions, and processes between states can augment their functions. So we're trying to chart existing technical tools, develop new ones, and provide a range of policy guidelines to ensure that this happens responsibly, safely, effectively. So the classic question that we get in response is, why can't you just ask an LLM? Lots of people are interested in trying to see if language models can simulate diplomacy or if chatbots can guide people through a negotiation all in one step. But ultimately, language models are remarkable and their use should be carefully scoped for 3 key reasons. Firstly, their fluency isn't necessarily verifiable in this international in world politics. Secondly, the opacity where you can't tell what's going on inside a model is not always verifiable. High stake is not always viable, because high stakes negotiations require accountability, both democratically and internally, to understand why recommendations shape treaties in certain ways. And additionally, there's a toolkit that's 80 years old here. We have game theory, decision analysis, machine learning, a great range of theoretical developments that exist precisely to model strategic interactions under uncertainty. And so we see LLMs as playing this role at the heart of a really broad set of learning paradigms that's tying together, well, both like supervised and unsupervised, self-supervised learning here. But LLMs provide a really strong way to interact with all of these different learning paradigms and technical architectures that the best advances in AI have been built from. So whether that's the systems that play chess or Go or board games, these are all pulling together lots of different methods. And if we just rely on chatbots at the heart of things, we miss out on all of the technical developments that the last 80 years have experienced. But there are three key challenges with trying to expand these techniques into the world of diplomacy and world politics. Firstly, representation. As Savina was touching on, the game that's being played here isn't a board game. These are things that these interactions are fundamentally changeable over time. The institutions that constrain the actions of states can be made and unmade over the course of a negotiation. Inference, like these are environments where there's real strategic misrepresentation, where people are lying or deceiving or trying to shape outcomes for their own advantages in ways that the current methods aren't quite well suited to handle. And finally, there's as we're touching on, there's this sense of specifying success. How can you bring together all of the different counterparts and come up with a relatively coherent set of preferences and priorities over the course of a really massive negotiation? So these are three challenges that we're trying to embark on. And one of the ways that we're approaching this is by breaking down the tasks of diplomacy and the tasks of negotiation for AI applications. So just broadly, one of the ways we've looked at this is saying that there are some foundational tasks of research, analysis, strategizing, and execution that build this evidence base with research, that analysis processes the information that you've managed to gather. Strategizing relies on using the analysis and the research to come up with a map from your preferences to your outcomes. And then finally, in the room, executing a negotiation, you've got to be able to dynamically adapt and adjust over time. And this isn't a linear process, but a reentrant cyclical sense of you have all of these things as they change, feeding up through this like knowledge base. And so you need this really strong computational infrastructure to be able to even begin to apply some of the really exciting and fascinating AI and ML methods we're touching on. So with this, we see a future where research can be done with autonomous research agents, and you can have source validations and get immediately generated counterpart biographies, analysis of gaps and preferences and evidence bases, strategy sandboxes, red team training, and trying to simulate how both the public might respond or how different parties might respond, and then in real time having transcription and translation services that AI and ML methods are doing a really phenomenal job at. All of these things we think will play a role in this multi-model, multi-method world of computational support for diplomacy negotiations. And so this is just a sense of how we've tried to break down this problem and get a grasp on the existing and future technical developments. Finally, we want to end on these three commitments that are central to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about. One, human authority has to remain central. We can't have any objection of responsibility over decisions of war and peace. We have to make sure that the tools themselves are modular and transparent so that you can see what's happening at each stage of the process and which parts of which computational systems are supporting analysis. And then finally, making sure that augmentation is appropriately scoped for the team, the institution, and the setting that it's in. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Michael in the panel, our director of the program, and what I hope will be a wonderful discussion on some of these issues. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Lavina. So just as everybody's sort of getting settled in, so we have a plan for a project. We have a vision of how one has a set of signposts and goalposts in what is essentially the ability to augment with intelligence, human intelligence and participation. So there are lots of technical elements of that. We'll be developing tools. We're looking at evaluation methodologies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's the whole technical side. But one of the benefits of the approach we're taking is that we have access to a large body of people for whom the day-to-day practice of negotiation diplomacy not necessarily constrained by the definition of diplomacy, meaning state to state to get to an answer, but organization to organization, people to people, negotiation to negotiation. And I am delighted then to have three people here who can talk a little bit about their views on how artificial intelligence will be used in the process of their work. And that allows us to then learn from that experience and how we map that into the Move 37 project. So Gabriela, let me start with you. Welcome. Thank you for negotiating all the traffic to get here. So you've been at the center of international policy design and negotiations on issues such as climate change, international taxation, gender equality, artificial intelligence, a whole list of things in a brilliant career. You've done this through key roles at UNESCO, but also at the G20 and G7 and at the OECD. We're delighted to have you here. And let me ask you just to sort of start the discussion, if you would, to just talk a little bit about what it's like to sit in the driver's seat as a mediator, trying to bridge sides, and how you would think about AI capability augmenting you in that process.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. Is it working? For inviting me to this early morning. And I find this topic fascinating because when you are a diplomat and when you have negotiated many standards or agreements, you don't think about this taxonomy. You never think about the taxonomy. You just think that you need to get it at some day and that you need to find consensus and that you need to find where the problems will be. And therefore, it's very interesting that you asked me something to structure better how we do things. And I'm going to refer to the negotiation of the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence because that was a very difficult one. 193 countries negotiating during COVID. And actually, it was very helpful to have a Zoom where I could see where all the countries were positioning themselves, which actually helped a lot. But the interesting thing is that it was about artificial intelligence, so we were negotiating, and we have to map out where countries were. And it was very interesting to see that some of the usual suspects that are always blocking the effectiveness of international instruments were aligning with countries that are very supportive of those, but that didn't want to see UNESCO playing a role in this field. So I have Russia and I have UK in the same position. That helped me because I called the UK and say, are you happy to be in the same position? And then they just hold on 1 second. But the interesting thing is it's a very heavy document. It's very, very, because there are so many cultures, we had to almost define step by step. And the interesting thing is that when thinking how can AI help us organize better, at the moment, it did not provide with so many inputs. It was 2021. But UNESCO has this idea of being super inclusive. We developed the recommendation with all the regions in the world represented and all the disciplines. But then we put it out to the world and we received 55,000 comments. Therefore, we use AI to integrate them. Yeah. That was, no. But then when you think about how do you map the positioning of countries, I think that would have been super useful to have more AI. I used to have full teams providing me with briefings for the people we were going to talk, because you need to be conducting a lot of, one thing is the negotiation in the room, another thing is all the legwork that you need to be doing, talking to the different actors, knowing where they stand. That would have been amazing, just to have a repository of what is the traditional position of certain countries or certain negotiations, which had to do with the substance, but probably has to do also with the positioning of that country in the international context and how much they abide by the rules and how much they support these things. And then what I find fascinating, but this is always, as my colleagues here said, how you keep the woman in the loop. I love it. Yes, woman in the loop, not human in the loop. Human in the loop. It was a lapsus.
It's not lost on me. My panelists here are all helping.
It was a lapsus, but I like my lapsus. The whole point is when you are in front of a person and you're trying to convince that person that he's alone, nobody's supporting his position, and therefore he should not continue blocking the negotiation. How would it be that you can have more information about that person? What moves them? How can you offer something that will be important for them? Because this is the kind of things that we do. negotiating? What would you want to have out of it? I know you have your bosses in your shoulder and you need to bring them something to the table, but tell them you're alone, that you're blocking it. And imagine you can have the information about that person, but that's also risky because it deals with privacy and all of those things. But I feel it would be fantastic because this is strategic thinking and using the right words to get the countries to agree that will bring you on some places, and that's a capacity that can be augmented by AI.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you very much for, actually it's a terrific transition because Charlie was talking about the complexity of these negotiations, about how they're not dynamic. I can think of nothing more dynamic than a UNESCO negotiation. Just trying to understand where people's positions are by itself is a complexity. Trying to integrate 20 or 30 of those positions or 190 of those positions, and then trying to find what are the right levers that I might be able to pull. We do this now all the time with people, with you. And the question is, how can modern tools help in that process without removing or absolving responsibility for people? So thank you. So Nandita, you have had an amazing career in academia, the public, the private sector. You've been at Stanford. You've worked in intelligence and advisory, and you've seen all sides of these negotiations, both from the government side, the private sector side, inside and outside. You are currently at the Director of Intelligence at the Special Competitive Studies Project. For those of you who don't know, SCSP is a major effort funded by Eric Schmidt, sponsored by Eric Schmidt after the conclusion of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence in the US, in the way that technology will be used in competition for economics, national security, et cetera. So it's a big, broad role. Every day you are negotiating. Every day in your life you have negotiating. So can I just ask you to talk a little bit about your view, both from an SCSP point of view, but also from your career, about how you would see this evolving?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having me, and good morning, everyone. So my career, as you mentioned, has sort of spanned 3 distinct sectors, and they kind of came at different times: academia, public sector, and private sector. Now, there was a time, I would say, that all 3 of these groups would have, the particular ways they would have leveraged technology would have, obviously, its variations, but the access and adoption of it were much more similar. This is just fundamentally not true of AI. The public sector has been more in the passenger seat, if not the back seat, especially over the last decade. And so what was really interesting to me is I started in academia, then went to the public sector, came out of the private sector, and I saw that dip in my access to AI. Now, I have been in intelligence, and one important thing about intelligence, and maybe a misconception of it, is that it is primarily used for military, feeding information for military applications. It's not true. We are just as vital to diplomatic efforts, because every opportunity you're looking for that something bad could happen, you're just as much looking at what are the opportunities for something positive to happen. How can you open the negotiating space? So we're looking at everything from both sides of that perspective. As an analyst, I can say personally, it was very valuable to have the rigorous training I had to do things very, very manually, so learning how to write an assessment without the access to AI. But now that I'm on the back end of it, I can tell you every day I ask myself, if I had had access to these tools as an analyst, how could I have worked much faster and much smarter? Because at the end of the day, and this is something that Gabriela was mentioning, there's a lot of data out there, but a human analyst is never going to be able to manually process most of that by themselves. The story I always like to tell is, the very first time I wrote this intelligence piece, I was so proud of it. I thought the argumentation was great. The data I'd used was great. I showed it to a mentor, and they said, "This is awesome, but you didn't consider this one piece of data from 10 years ago that completely negates your argument." And here's the thing. It's not that I didn't do good work. It's just that there was no way I was going to know that that piece of information exists. Now imagine a tool that can help you not only identify that that data exists, but learn how to synthesize it. Now, obviously, as Charlie and Slovena mentioned, human in the loop is always going to be important because you want these assessments to have a human level at the end of it, but there is a way to move better and smarter. And this is something that SCSP is really advocating for in sort of 3 distinct ways. So first, at a very meta level, we make the argument that AI has fundamentally changed the threat landscape and the scope for global competition. It is now sort of the foundational way we need to think about geopolitics, especially as this technology is rapidly evolving. So you really cannot divorce AI and AI adoption when you're trying to understand geopolitics and foreign policy. Number two, in order to have an ability to make assessments about this emerging technology, to understand geopolitics, you have to have a public sector that is actually leveraging these tools to the best of their ability. Now, there are a lot of ways that AI is being adopted at the public sector, in the public sector. You know, you're obviously thinking about again, military applications of drones, but you need to have your day-to-day workflows integrating this technology. And this is something that we are really focusing on, especially about how to build up AI literacy within the public sector. Not just at the military level, but within the intelligence community, within the State Department, and even between like commerce, OPM, all the any federal sector employee at some point needs to be moving smarter and faster with AI. And third, we're looking at the specific use cases. So one of the projects that we were working on last year is looking at how AI can be used for predicting geopolitical events, both for military applications, but also for State Department applications. So, and the reason we do that is because in order to convince the public sector that they should be using AI, you almost need to show them how it could look like 10 years from now as we're moving to that future. So by kind of demystifying its use and showing them targeted ways that you can use it, it actually solves your meta problem of understanding why AI is so important to geopolitics.
Fantastic. So I'm hearing a couple of things. I'm hearing this general statement that much of the world is going to be about AI, and much of the world is going to be AI creating that world. And that's the metaphor that comes directly to the project we're looking at, which is we're negotiating with AI tools. We have to have a baseline of capability. And yet the landscape in which negotiation and diplomacy are happening is being fundamentally changed by AI itself. And so that whole issue around preparedness and around setting the ground rules. I also heard not just the thought process around artificial intelligence as a trusted agent to accumulate information, both of you mentioned that, but also as an agent to help understand new pathways for success, new pathways for leverage, whether those are national security or whether those are economic vitality. The scope of the negotiations doesn't really change that. So in the area of sort of preparation, let me come to you, Robin. Robin is the co-founder and CEO of Apolitical. Apolitical is a global platform for policymakers that specializes in government innovation. She'll talk about that in just a second. In particular, you've courses in helping governments prepare their workforces for the modern world in which they live. Your AI courses have reached hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And much of what you are trying to do is to prepare the world for the kind of things that we are talking about in Move 37, obviously much broader than just that topic. So let me ask you to talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind. What sort of lessons you've learned from the field, and how you think about policymakers' willingness, or how you change policymakers' willingness to embark on journeys with new tools and new capabilities.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. Let me set the scene a little bit and then provide some of the data we've gathered, which I think shines a light on those questions. Is this mic working well?
Yep.
So I co-founded Apolitical just over 10 years ago with a mission to make governments smarter to deliver for people and the planet. So we've always been about outcomes, and we've always been at our heart a network for the public sector. There are 200 million people working in core government units, 600 million in the wider public sector. So it's the world's largest workforce. Fast forward to today, that word smarter has of course taken on new meaning in the age of AI. What we look like is we're a network on our core platform of over 500,000 public servants in 160 countries. That spans all levels of government, local through to multilateral. It includes non-elected and political public servants. It includes diplomats. And then our training and tools are integrated into government platforms, reaching a further 40 million public servants around the world. So we have a lot of data and a kind of real-time pulse on how governments are adapting to the age of AI. And AI is everywhere. It is kind of the water in which we are the fish now. We're soon not going to recognize that we're in the water. So we do a lot of work on climate and energy, and it's, for example, and it's dominating that conversation too. We have to today trained a little under 400,000 public officials globally in the responsible use of AI. That spans fundamentals through to more domain-specific applications such as AI in climate, for example, we tend to work with leading universities such as Stanford HAI is one of our collaborators. So we are more context experts than content experts, and we bring the content experts into the middle. So where are we at? Let me give you some data. And this is from a 5,000 person survey that we've recently run. Overall, public servants are incredibly optimistic about AI. North of 90% think there is huge possibility in the public sector. And there are lots of paradoxes here. They're also wary of it, right? There is a huge value creation opportunity. One figure from BCG estimates that there's 1.75 trillion of public sector value to be unlocked if we harness AI in the right way, because AI loves bureaucracy, all these repeatable processes. And about a third of most public officials' daily work is research and writing related. AI is great at that. So the prize is very, very big, and that's just the painkiller prize. When you get to the vitamin prize, when you get to what AI could do in terms of predictive policy making and responsive policy and adaptive policy, etc., then you get into a space that's only really bounded by the imagination. So there's lots of AI talk, there's less AI action. Increasingly, we're in a pilotitis zone where almost everyone's got pilots. 70% of leaders say they either got AI pilots or plan to launch them this year, but only 45% of them say they have any plan to evaluate their pilots. So that's a pretty big gap to close. And we see gaps like this all the time. One of the biggest gaps is leaders not using the technology themselves, which is a real problem because you can't understand this technology in the abstract. You cannot look over your grandson's shoulder and see them using it. You've got to use it. You've got to feel the speed of change. Of the public servants who are implementing AI in the public sector globally, these are people who self-identify of AI, having AI in their jobs. Only 26% of them say they understand their own country's ethical frameworks. So approximately 3/4 of all the people rolling out this technology are freestyling. That's terrifying. So that's a skills and knowledge gap, not even closed within an institution. It's not even getting to how do we actually understand the basics of this technology. Just to close, and there's a whole lot more fascinating data, but one of the things that is increasingly worrying me, talking to leaders around the world working on this, is that we are now getting quite drunk on the idea of AI agency, but we're not talking about human agency in the process and maintaining it. So I think we risk getting into a zero-sum dynamic where, and I think this is relevant to diplomacy, where the agency drains away to AI, and that all comes at a cost to humans. So we need to be building up humans at the same time. And the framing and heuristic I found most helpful for this overall is this idea of, that's recently emerged, of being below or above the algorithm. If you're below the algorithm, you might be an Uber driver being dispatched, an Amazon packing worker being allocated to put stuff into boxes. If you're above the algorithm, you are using tools to further your goals. We need, when we think about closing that capability gap, and I think in diplomacy, to keep moving people up above the algorithm.
Great, fantastic comments from all of you. Thank you. I'm going to ask Charlie and Slovenia just a couple of quick comments to make comments on the project, because then I'm going to come back to the three of you, and I'll prompt you with the question now, which is, what would you want to be comfortable with knowing about the tools and the capabilities that you will be asked to use or be offered to use? So, Slovenia, can you just follow on Robin's comments? One of the benefits we have of doing this program at the Belfer Center and the Kennedy School is a large set of people who have done this for a living. This is what diplomats and negotiators have done. Can you talk a little bit about how we engage that group and what we're trying to get from that?
Definitely. So I think, as Michael put it, obviously at the Belfer Center, we have quite a variety of current, former diplomats, practitioners, not just from the US, but from all over the world. And a large part of the work that we've been doing is sitting down for one-on-one interviews with all of them and really getting a sense of how they think not just about the content of the major negotiations that they've been leading, but more about the process. So very similar to the panel discussion we're having here today, what are some of the uses that you see one day you could be using AI for? So a lot of what we've heard so far, I mean, the position tracking that I think Gabriela referenced, we've heard a lot about historical precedent, the generating of options and strategic options, and really uncovering the deepest interests. And I think where this ties really well to what Robin was saying is a lot of them are also expressing their hesitancies. So they're being very forthcoming in that. And I think that allows us to take a really sober look at what are the risks of integrating these tools. One of the main questions we get is, if you're using these tools, we ask them, what would you like to know? So exactly what Michael's saying now. So a lot of these interviews have really been integrated across the different work streams of our project, and we really put diplomats and practitioners at the heart of the rest of the work that we're doing.
Great, thank you. And Charlie, you talked a little bit before about, there's an obvious role that LLMs can play in helping people accumulate and synthesize a very large amount of information. But there are many more aspects of a negotiation. Can you talk just a little bit about some of the other ways the tools are going to be used in the project that we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, and thanks so much for the comments as well so far. The panelists have touched on a couple of really interesting applications, whether it's, especially as Robin was talking about with predictive or adaptive policies, if you're looking at, and Nandita as well, with the predictive geopolitical events. We have a really fascinating array of algorithms that are incredibly competent at these sorts of predictive tasks. And what we now have with the current computational ability and also the ability of language models is we can process vast amounts of unstructured data in ways that makes these algorithms even more accessible to a wider range of people. So I think that's one area that I'm particularly excited about. There's also a bunch of stuff, as Gabriela was touching on, is how do you take these vast unstructured transcripts and come up with natural language processing additions on top, and can we represent positions as they track and change over time? I think that is one of the big parts of cognitive load that I think diplomats have spoken about a lot.
Great, thank you. We're going to see if questions from the audience here in just a moment, but Nandita, I'm going to start with you. I'm going to, forgive me for doing this, I'm going to characterize your career as an analyst.
Yes.
Every job that I read and see about has been an analyst of some kind. You're constantly in a place where people are suggesting new tools and new capabilities. So think about AI in the world you've inhabited. What's going to make you most comfortable when somebody shows up and says, here's a thing, it's going to make your life better?
That they can explain what the outputs are. So one of the things, when we were looking at, for example, could we be using AI for predicting geopolitical events, a lot of people, both in industry, in academia, and in the public sector that are working on these types of projects, they all say the same thing, which is this should be seen as a data point or a shaper of the way you should view the world, not as finished intelligence. Finished intelligence should always ultimately be done by a human who is accountable to their policymakers. Now, if you are working in policy, you understand actually how this works. You'll have your head of state or your head of government come to you and ask you to explain exactly how you got to your assessment. Right now, we have a human who ultimately has to do that. But what happens when we're starting to rely more and more on AI tools is you never want to lose that ability to explain the outputs and particularly demonstrate that you've looked at all the counterpoints that you could possibly do. Now, this is where I think AI is super helpful, because oftentimes when I was trying to figure out especially in academia, what are all the things I could have done wrong? How could I have measured this differently? You're always prepared to thinking about all the decisions that you made and how to justify and validate them. But as the scenarios get broader, as they get more complicated, your ability to figure out what the counter arguments are going to just dwindle over time. Oftentimes the argument we make is that humans are biased at the end of the day. We make our decisions based on how we got to where we are today, all the experience that you have. So AI can be really, really helpful in helping you sort out the counter arguments, but you still need to understand how those counter arguments work and why ultimately you've come to the assessment that you have. So where I would feel super comfortable is, this is how I relied on AI. This is how it came to the output that it did. This is fundamentally why I made the assessment that I did.
Great, thank you. And Robin, I think this is the world you live in every day, of helping governments and government officials and civil service workers. So project that onto an AI for diplomacy landscape. What do you think is going to be important to get people to say, I'm going to trust this, I'm going to work it, but I'm at least going to try?
Well, at the risk of stating the obvious, I think we should just acknowledge that the people developing these models don't even have full legibility over how they're working.
Right.
So that's where we're starting from. So that's the kind of ceiling on where we can get to. Now you can break down the thinking process, as it were, but you still have that black box. I don't think it's insurmountable. I think some of the things I'm worried about relates to the more psychological aspect of this, and in particular, sleeping at the wheel, this phenomenon where we have this strange relationship with AI where we get false negatives too quickly. So it like does a bunch of clever things, except it didn't do this one thing, and therefore we can't use it for anything. And if you check back in like a month's time, often it can do the thing. So you have that, the false negative, and then the phenomenon of sleeping at the wheel is where it starts to get very, very good, creeping upwards of like 85, 90% accuracy. And then you assume it's 100% accurate. And it's really quite hard to edit your assumptions and say, no, it's not. And you've probably all found this, if they're power users of AI, and I'm one of them, sometimes it comes across as so smart and so brilliant and comes up with a whole lot of counter arguments. I use it for sort of kicking the tires from different perspectives all the time on stuff I'm doing. That it's almost overwhelmingly smart, and you're like, it must have covered everything. That's a default. So I think giving us the human tools and the psychological counter arguments and weaponry to deal with this is really, really important. I already have a heuristic that whenever I open my phone and I'm dealing with anything with an algorithm, I am in opposition to that algorithm because its interests don't generally coincide with mine. So I try and get all algorithmic stuff off my phone as like a starting point. But the dynamic with AI is a bit different, but I still think you have to have that sort of battle mentality with the technology. So that would be there are many other things to consider, but that's top of mind.
I think that's terrific, and I think I think this idea of calibrating on the use, like what I want from a completeness when I ask for analysis, may be very different than what I want from can you just give me some different ideas that I haven't thought about before? And different stages in a negotiation are going to require different levels of calibration. So, Gabriela, what do you think?
It's very difficult to follow these two girls. But the fact is that when you know a little bit more about how these things work, I'm not a technologist, but I have been looking at all of what can go wrong. Misrepresentation, overrepresentation of certain cultures, certain languages, assumptions. Therefore, if I am negotiating and you're going to offer me a tool to improve my negotiating skills, I need to be sure that the assumptions that you use to build that tool are not just to beat the person in front of me, are not just to maximize efficiency, are not just to do the kind of things that we are teaching the AI to do. And therefore is much more complex. Because what you want to do is to open a space of human understanding. How do you do that? And therefore I will be questioning, as Robin said, always questioning, but it's not what we do. And the other point is that the AI, what is amazing, is that it's just reproducing cognitive abilities that humans do. So when you go into the using whatever chat box you use to get information, you take for granted what it comes out. What you would never do if you hire somebody in the first week. Exactly. Even if you have done all the checkpoints for that person to have the capacities that you are looking in the market. So I feel that there is this question of first really bringing to the table tools that are going to be reliable and trustworthy. And I know that these words are almost a cliche, but the reality is that sometimes they're not. And the other point is that you can become very lazy. And how do you avoid just to grab the thing and say, that's perfect? How do you keep that space for ourselves to take the decisions and be not only in the driver's seat, but actually to think of AI as a supporter cast? And if we get the Oscar, it's us and not the AI.
That's fantastic. I have this mental picture in my mind for those of you who've done negotiations in any kind. The first thing you do is you grab a bunch of your team in a room and you say, let's talk about strategy and what are we going to do? And you know, Bob in the corner says, here's an option, and you realize Bob had a bad night last night, so maybe you discount what Bob says. So what happens when the AI says, here's a thing? I don't just trust it, a priori. I have to apply a human judgment to what I'm hearing. So terrific points. Okay, we have time for a question or two, and I see one. Just say who you are, where you're from, and a quick question.
Thanks so much, Michael.
We have microphones? Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm Sam Dawes. I'm a Senior Advisor to the Oxford University AI Governance Initiative and Director of Multilateral AI. But my background is in diplomacy, working for Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General, and then for the Foreign Office and Cabinet Office. So I wish we'd had AI tools back then. So really, I was really inspired. It's such a timely, rich panel, so thank you all for that. Something that Gabriella said around culture, I think is so important. And I'm thinking about the positives and the risks with applying AI in this space. How can we ensure that the diverse cultural inputs of different societies are embedded in the data sets and the models which inform negotiations? So is that something that UNESCO is working on in the long term and connects to the tools we use? And the second question is around the flip side. If AI is to be a useful neutral mediator in disputes or an assistant to a mediator, a human mediator, then what do we do about data poisoning and prompt injection and those kinds of risks? Thank you.
Probably very fast, more on, not on the question, the question of culture. Culture is expressed by language. And therefore, the more we can try to represent those languages in the models we use, I think the best we will be prepared to understand it. And I'm fascinated by that. I'm not a linguistic, but if I would choose another life, I will do that. Mm-hmm. Because when you hear, for example, there was this Namibian representative during the negotiations of the ethics of AI, and she was saying, I find your draft very individualistic. It's always about the human. It's always about the outcomes for people, improving their welfare, no? And at the end, what I'm thinking about is the Ubuntu philosophy, which is I am because you are, and we are because it's nature, and we are interlinked. And therefore, how do you capture these when the models that we are developing are maximizing individual welfare? And so the only answer I have is try to be representative, and I think this is nothing new. We have seen how much these tools can discriminate if you are just built in one language or with the representation of certain characteristics of people or countries. But really to be sure that you are capturing the richness that comes through language and opening up the sources, and that's the other point, the sources. This is one thing that I would always ask. The answer you're giving me is based on what sources? And that will might help, but these are checkpoints that we always need to be testing on the ground.
I think you also, if I just raise one other thing, I think you raised one other really important point, which is, there's a whole spectrum of things here. There is negotiation because we have a set of interested parties to get to a common good understanding. We also have very adversarial negotiations. So adversarial negotiations open up this whole possibility of data poisoning, of training set differentiation, et cetera. So it's a very complex world. I really appreciate you bringing it up. We have time for one more question, I think. Let's go right here. So, can somebody tell me, are we counting down to 0 or are we counting down to 5? Are we okay to keep going to 0 here? Okay, good. We're going to go to 0 no matter what. So
Good morning.
Please.
Good
Yes.
morning. Namaste. My name is Devika Rao. I meet 300 to 600 people per day, and I work around different languages. So basically, I'm an Indian classical dance teacher.
Okay.
So, so I have a data. I have a human connection. So, and what we want to do, how this cultural education can be supported by AI. So what is the step I can take further? Presently, I'm actually working on a framework, cultural framework, which is India and UK POCC 2025-2030. So I'm also interested in NEP and national health policy, because people connected to their health and education, which is a center point. So where I can go and what kind of co-creation, collaboration can
Sure.
happen in this.
Robin, is this something you want to jump in on? Maybe give her your email address, huh?
I wish I had an immediate response to that. I don't think there is any default place to go, but I do think this is where the conversation is evolving, and there's more and more recognition of the cultural oversight and importance. So I would just encourage you to please keep making those points. And I will just make one comment on the first question. The Swiss have built, it's kind of sort of a quasi-Swiss government, quasi-multilateral initiative to build an LLM that is trained from the outset on more than 100 languages. And it is actually run by a friend of mine who's a former Swiss diplomat. So she's coming at it very much with a diplomatic context. I'm very happy to make that connection.
Education, super complex. Don't look at the technology. Because we always focus on the technology. The countries that have introduced so much technology in their educational systems didn't get better student outcomes because of content. We go to the internet and we go to the systems and we try to bring tools to help kids, and we never see if they are contextually relevant, culturally linked, and therefore, if you don't produce the content, the tools will not make it.
I'll just add one last thing. Is I think the way to think about AI is also is it actually solving a problem, or are you just trying to introduce it to create a new problem? I think this is where you have to think about the point of AI augmentation. I think there are a lot of ways we can think about how AI can augment the problem sets that we have, but sometimes you don't actually have the problem that AI is going to solve, and you don't need to force AI to fix it.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to negotiate. If you have a really quick question, you can ask it. No, behind you. Sorry. It's got to be quick, though.
Yeah, my name is Arman. I'm working for JPAL South Asia. Just a quick question on how do you think this would impact balance of power, like given that every country had different access to the kind of data sets that they have, and as we saw, there can be 3 states also in the play. How it would look like state A knows everything about the rest of the players and the others don't. So yeah.
So we think a lot about that. I'll answer this if you guys are okay. We think a lot about this in the project, which is what's the evolution of a set of AI tools. It's like everything else that we are here at this conference, which is where will tools provide competitive leverage? Where are the kind of tools in the world we live in, ones that should be dispersed actively and offensively, not defensively, in a world where some of the negotiation is about getting everybody to a positive and some of the negotiation is adversarial. So I think it is a huge element of how it will change power structures, not just because it's a thing we think about from a negotiation and diplomacy, but because a general AI tool. So, okay, with that, we are just about out of time. I want to thank this amazing panel, Gabriella, Nandita, and Robin. I want to thank my colleagues, Slavina and Charlie, and I want to thank all of you. We are at the beginning of a long process. When you work at a place like I do at the Belfer, you think about projects that have beginnings, middles, and ends, and you think about projects that can grow into something really, really important. So any of you who have interest in what we're doing, please let us know if you feel like you have questions that we ought to be asking, or you have answers to questions we have asked. We would love to hear from you as we begin to build what we think is a really important discipline. So thank you, and thank you to the sponsors and hosts. I appreciate everybody joining us. Thank you. Sorry that I couldn't get to that. Do you have a question?
Ladies and gentlemen, please exit the room from your left side. Thank you.